Okay, Chapter 11, Trade Policy in Developing Countries. This chapter is related with developing countries' development under the system of free trade, right? Trade and development, simply talking. So this chapter is quite closely related with development issue, okay? This chapter consists of 3 sections. Section number 1, import substituting industrialization. Section 2, trade liberalization since 1985. Section 3, trade and growth. I'd like to explain structure, right? So after World War II, right? So most of the developing countries adopt that is time, right? Time. So after World War II, most countries adopt ISI, import substituting industrialization strategy, right? ISI, import substituting industrialization, right? That is economist recommendation for developing country is this one, ISI. So import substituting industrialization. Industrialization means, so how can I explain industrialization? Industrialization means think about production in GDP. So GDP consists of agriculture and manufacturing and services, right? Before capitalist development, in, for example, agricultural society, right? So usually agricultural industry becomes industrialized countries, industrialized society, transformation from agricultural to industrialization society. That means in this agricultural society, agricultural share in total production is critical. Most of production occurred in agricultural sector, right? But industrialization means agricultural sector share decrease and manufacturing share increase. Okay? That is industrialization. In Korean we say 산업화, right? This industrialization is accompanied by urbanization, right? You know, urbanization in Korean 도시화, right? Society moving to agricultural to industrialized. One, right? Usually most of laborers reside in urban area instead of rural area, right? So industrialization accompanies with urbanization. Okay, that is industrialization. For example, in 1945 was 8 in Korea. Agricultural share is almost 70%, 60 to 70%, I think, right? And service sector is about 30%, and manufacturing share is very low, right? But now, manufacturing share, agricultural share in GDP is, I think, about 2%, less than 2%, right? 1% or 2% in GDP, right? But manufacturing share is about 30 to 40%. Service is 50 to 6% like this, right? So industrialization finished in Korea. So ISI, this I means industrialization. Why that happened? Why that happened? After transforming to agriculture to industrialized one, per capita GDP increased. Per capita GDP increased. Per capita income increased. Right? Because manufacturing, hiring using same factors, producing more, consume more. So per capita GDP increased. So eradication of poverty, that is a motto of a developing country, isn't it, right? That the purpose, target is quite clear. Eradication of poverty to increase per capita GDP. Can you understand? That is industrialization. And ISI means industrialization in import substituting sector, right? So we already studied that import happening comparative disadvantage sector, isn't it? Right? For example, developing countries after World War II, their main, Latin American case, usually main industry is agriculture, right? Developing countries' main industry at that time was agriculture. And comparative advantage in agriculture, especially for Latin American countries, right? And comparative disadvantage in manufacturing sector, right? So ISI means industrialize. They want to industrialize their country in the way of industrialization occurred in manufacturing, in comparative disadvantage sector. Can you understand? So they enter manufacturing sector directly to increase per capita GDP. Okay? That is ISI. Import substituting industrialization. For example, in Latin America, at the time, they import most of cars and TV set and refrigerator, everything from United States and Europe, right? And after Second World War, they start industrialization in that sector in a way that substituting imports to domestically produced one, right? That is ISI. So economists' recommendation for developing countries, developing strategy is in ISI. The other concept is EOI, export-oriented industrialization strategy, right? This one usually industrialization focused on export sector, right? Export, rather than import, right? So that is EOI. So the two is constricting concept. Actually, after Second World War, most of developing countries adopt ISI. That is economists' recommendation, right? And only some countries like Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore at the time adopt EOI, right? Why? Because of money. If Brazil or Argentina and the other Latin American countries adopt this one, they enter just to produce a car, simply, right? Then what happened? They produce a car domestically, right? And the production cost of car is, for example, $20,000. If this one is imported from United States or US, same car should be just $10,000. Can you understand? So United States and European countries can produce cars with cheaper cost than developing countries. So this country has comparative disadvantage, but they want produce car directly. Then domestic consumers do not want to purchase domestically produced one. Then imported one. Why? Expensive. Same car, expensive. Right? Then how to solve this kind of problem? Imposing high tariff. For example, 200% tariff. Then domestically produced one is 20,000. Imported one is 1 plus 200%. Right? Then $30,000. Okay? Then inefficient domestically producers have no problem to sell their domestically produced car to domestic consumers. Okay? But to produce this car with a higher cost, anyway, they didn't accumulate a lot of some technology or productivity at all. So they have to import lots of parts and components of car, engine or accelerator, right? Key parts and components from developed countries. So domestic production of car requires lots of imports. This one necessarily entails imports of important parts and components from overseas. This means that to produce this car domestically, they have to import. That means they have money. Latin American country at the time was much richer country than Korea because they export lots of agricultural goods to European countries and United States, right? They have lots of money, so they can import key components and parts of car and domestically production happen. Okay? That is ISI. But in Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, for example, no money. For example, Korea, we have no money to import key components and parts. So we have no other option but to adopt EOI, just enter the industry of comparative advantage. At the time, Korea has comparative advantage in the production of agricultural goods, minerals, and wigs, right? Wigs, cobalt, or toys, really labor-intensive sectors, right? So some East Asian countries adopt EOI, right? And the economists believe that ISI should be successful. And this one is not so good. It's economists' prediction. But what happened? After 1985, right? 1985, we realized that countries adopt ISI like Latin America, China, India, and most of developing countries. ISI, performance of IS is really bad. Failure, total failure. Why? So we know that growth rates of GDP in those countries who adopt ISI is very low. But the countries who adopt EOI, growth rates of EOI countries is very high. Right? So the result in the real world is quite different from economists' prediction. Total failure, total successful. Okay? In terms of growth rates in GDP. Right? You know, so 70 rule, some rule like this. Right? 70 over growth rates. What is this? This is what is this? That is ln 70, ln 2 over ln g, right? Then approximate value is 70 over g. That means if one country grows 10% per annum, g is 10%, then 70 divided by 10 is 7, isn't it? Right? That means if one economy grows 10% annually, then after 7 years, GDP doubled. Can you understand? If growth rate is 7%, then 70 over 7, so 10 years. Right? Doubling years of some GDP or something is 10 years. That is formula to calculate the years to double. Okay? Also, same thing, if you borrow money, interest rate is 10, for example, 10%. Then you borrow, for example, $10,000. Then this $10,000 becomes, if interest rate is 10%, after 7 years you have to refund $20,000. Can you understand? So growth rate is really important. In terms of growth rate, this one is total failure, this one is total successful. Can you understand? Right? So, section 2 is trade liberalization since 1985. So, Latin American countries changed their developmental strategy from IS to EOI from mid-1980s. After 1980s, all the countries adopt EOI, right? EOI. Instead of scrapping ISI. Can you understand? So in section 2 is trade liberalization since 1985. Then what happened? After changing their developmental strategy from ISI to EOI in Latin America, for example, right? They expect the growth rate of ISI before 1985 much lower than growth rate in GDP or per capita GDP in EOI countries. So we change their strategy, EU. Right? Latin American countries also adopt EOI. But their growth rate is not so spectacular at all. They expect very high one, but their growth rates, Latin American countries' growth rates, EOI, right, is very similar to, for example, growth rate of Latin American country adopt ISI. This one and this one is not much different. A little, somewhat higher than this, but basically almost same. That means EOI is also not so successful, right? So you know NAFTA concluded in 1985, right? You have to understand why NAFTA concluded. They realized that ISI is total failure, so they have changed their trade policy to free trade, adopt EOI. But after that, their growth rate is not so good. Can you understand? Right? So that is a background of chapter 11. And section 3 is trade and growth in East Asia. East Asian countries, for example, Korea, growth rates in GDP before 1985 is more than 10%. Right? Until this period, Korea is the number one country who showed highest growth rates in GDP and per capita GDP. Right? Now Korea is, if we encompass all of period until now, Korea is number 2. Number 1 is, after 1980s, China is number 1. Right? And the other is, second is Korea, I think. Right? Then, why East Asian countries are so successful? Right? That is take up in Asia. So they believe that in this period, they believe that EOI was successful. EOI means exports. It's really important. Exports and imports is really important. That is the engine of high growth rate. That is the basic idea until 1985. Right? And they failed because ISI, import substitution strategy is not so good. But, as I said before, after 1985, after changing their trade policy to EOI, Latin American countries didn't show higher performance than before. Okay? So, now economists think that maybe East Asian countries' main engines of highest rapid economic growth in East Asia is not from exports or openness. Exports or openness. Rather than this, maybe the other thing exists. That is explained in section 3. What is this? Rapid accumulation of capital stock, rapid accumulation of human capital, and some institutional reform. Because of this, these countries show higher performance than ISI. Can you understand? That is the whole structure of chapter 11. Okay, considering this one, we go into detailed explanation. Introduction number 1. Which countries are developing countries? What is the definition of developing countries? The term developing countries does not have a precise definition, but it is a name given to many low and middle income countries. So definition of developing means per capita GDP is very low. Okay? So actually, per capita GDP is so significant indicator of developing countries. But we cannot find any other single indicator better than per capita income. Okay? So look at this table 11.1. United GDP per capita in year 2016. US, 56,000. Germany, 48,000. Japan, 38,000. Korea, maybe about almost 30,000. Right? Mexico, 18,000. China 13,000, Bangladesh so 3,000. So per capita GDP is a single indicator, really important, most powerful indicator of defining developing or developed. Okay. Now, section 2, ISI. Import substituting industrialization was a trade policy adopted in many low and middle income countries. Low and middle income countries means developing countries. Before the 1980s, most of developing countries, including Latin America, China, and India, adopt ISI strategy. They enter manufacturing sector directly, where these countries have no comparative advantage at all. Okay? The policy aimed to encourage domestic manufacturing by limiting competing imports. I already explained, right? So Latin American country can produce car with just $20,000, but US or Europe, EU produce at just $10,000. Then how to competitive at the market? How? By limiting competing imports. How? Imposing 200% tariff like this. Okay? So table 11.2 is the effective protection of manufacturing in some developing countries. Now think about ERP. We studied this in chapter 9, I think, right? Mexico's protection rate, so a sort of real, a sort of tariff is 26%, Philippines 61%, Brazil in 1966, 113%, Chile 182%, Pakistan 271%. So high rate of tariff or effective rate of protection means this one implies that all of these countries adopt ISI. So number one feature of ISI is high tariff or high effective rate of protection. Got it? The principal justification of this policy was the infant industry argument. Actually, economists recommend ISI, right? The basic argument supporting this is the infant industry argument, right? Infant industry argument. What is that? You know the meaning of infant, right? Really little child, infant. Infant. The industry level of developing countries is infant level industry. So, and infant industry argument said infant cannot compete with adult. It's not possible, isn't it? Become adult, individual, self. Infant should be cared, protected by the parents. Similarly, infant industry should be cared by government in terms of some ERP or tariff. That is infant industry argument. Countries may have a potential comparative advantage in some industries. So developing countries, Latin American countries, now has no comparative advantage in manufacturing, but in the future maybe has comparative advantage. So Latin American countries may have a potential comparative advantage in the future, right? But these industries cannot initially compete with well-established industries in developed one, right? So Brazil's car industry cannot compete with U.S. firms, right? Infant cannot compete with U.S. automakers, in spite of potential comparative advantage in the future, 10 years later or 20 years later, right? To allow this industry to establish themselves before they become adult, government should temporarily support them until they have grown strong enough to compete internationally. Can you understand? That is important in this argument, right? So important word is support should be important, but this kind of support should be temporal instead of permanent. Can you understand? So parents should care for children before adult. In that sense, temporal protection instead of permanent protection, right? Problems with the infant industry argument. The problems of infant industry argument. Number one, it may be wasteful to support industry now. That will have a comparative advantage in the future, right? So basic idea is before realizing potential comparative advantage, the infant should be cared. But number one argument against ISI is this. Why we spend money? Anyway, 28 years later, this industry should be competent, right? So, for example, there is one child who is really some potential, some capability in, for example, math. Why we have to teach mathematics in child days? Anyway, 10 years or 20 years later, this child should prove his competence in math. Why we have to spend money? Why we have to impose tariff like this? Can you understand? That is number one argument. Number two argument, with protection, infant industry may never grow or become competitive. Right? That is, with protection, infant industry may never grow, may never competent, never realize comparative advantage. Okay? So now we know this kind of thing, right? We care for infant and child very carefully by the parents. Then what happened? Infant, 10 years later or 20 years later, they resist to become adult one, right? Not independent from parents. That is really true, okay? So now we know that my friends who receive intensive care from parents and they become a doctor or professor or sometimes judge, right? But their mentality is still infant. If they face difficult some problems, they ask their parents how to judge, how to solve this problem like this, right? So same thing happened in the ISI in Latin American countries. The government expect after 20 years, car industry become competitive, but that kind of thing never happened, right? Anyway, from the perspective of firms, no reason to innovate, no reason to down the cost. Anyway, they can sell their some inefficient product with $20,000 until government impose 200% tariff. Why? I have to do my best to reduce production cost. Right? That happened. Because of this, ISI failed actually. Number three reason. There is no justification for government intervention unless there is a market failure that prevents the private sector from investing in infant industry. Right? So we already studied market failures. If market fails, government enter the market to remedy that kind of thing. That is a justification of government intervention. That is still valid. But number one and number two is a really critical cause, really critical problem in Latin America and China and India before 1980s. Though they failed. Okay? So we have to understand what happened in this period, early 1980s, late 90s. So Korean people know the foreign exchange shortage problem in 1997. That kind of thing happened. Okay?